And the way that verse spoke to me was that God had a different plan for my life, something in ministry, something working with people. And I chose then at that point to give up my career and to see what God would do if I gave my life to Him in ministry. Family life was not all good. My father had some mental health issues. I don't think it was ever properly diagnosed or treated in those days, but there was often tension in the home. When you see positive change in people's lives, boy, that's just wonderful. That makes it all worth it. And they told me, they said, "Did you hear what happened last week?" It was already a week after my father's suicide. And I said, no, back then, no cell phones, no social media, whatever.
Yeah.
And I said, no, I have no idea what happened. And they told me that he had committed suicide.
Yeah.
In those first 10 years of our marriage, I think we talked a lot about who needs the vehicle next, what do we need to shop for groceries, how do we pay this bill, where do we go for a holiday, whatever. Those were kind of the things we talked about. Be concerned about your children's hearts, not just about their behavior, about the outward appearances. Don't worry so much about the length of their hair or whether they have a piercing or something. Be concerned about where their hearts are at, that their hearts are tender towards the Lord and towards others. And Shepherding a Child's Heart is one of the books that we've read and used in our raising children. Keep the communication open with your kids. Don't put barriers there. So just as one example, if they come home and tell you something that they did and it was really not a good thing, don't get angry at them and yell at them. That puts up barriers. They won't want to tell you that same thing next time. So make sure the doors of communication stay open so that your kids are always willing to talk to you.
Brian, can you tell me your full name?
Brian Michael Burkhart.
What year were you born?
1961.
Where were you born?
In Toronto, Ontario.
And what was your childhood like?
It was not all bad, not all good. Had some really fun times both in Canada and in Germany. My family kind of moved back and forth in the early years of my life, and spent some time camping and fishing and part of some kids clubs growing up, and had 2 siblings, so we spent a lot of time together.
Nice.
So there were some good times, yeah.
Okay. And so what was your family life like when you were growing up? Was it?
Family life was not all good. My father had some mental health issues. I don't think it was ever properly diagnosed or treated in those days, but there was often tension in the home. My mother was the main breadwinner. My father had a hard time holding down a job. One of the symptoms of his mental health issues was paranoia, so he always thought people were out to get him, even trying to kill him, and so he never stayed at one job for very long at a time, and was sometimes even hospitalized because of his mental health issues. And so that caused a lot of tension and difficulty in the family.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was there any reason for him having such mental health issues?
Well, one reason I would think is the war. He was a young boy during the Second World War in Germany. His father was killed in the war, and him and his brother, I don't know all the stories, but I know that they witnessed some horrific things happening even in their own backyard during Second World War. And so I would assume that some of the trauma that he experienced as a child probably led to some of the mental health issues, yeah.
Okay. How did you become a Christian?
I don't remember any kind of faith-related things in our family until I was 11 years old. At that point, we moved to the hometown of my grandparents in Germany, and they were Christians who went to church on Sundays, and they took us to church, and we started going to some of the children's ministries and youth groups in the Lutheran church there in that town. And through that, I started to get some Christian teaching. I was later confirmed in the Lutheran church at the age of 14.
Okay.
And I don't know at what point I really started to believe, because my dad was a pretty strong atheist, and one of the things he told us was, it's okay to be part of a church. There's good people there. Just don't believe anything they teach you. And one of his favorite sayings was actually, don't believe anything you hear and only half of what you see.
Wow.
So he was a very skeptical man, and didn't believe in anything supernatural. And that was part of my DNA, I guess, growing up, that I was also very skeptical of anything supernatural. But I did start to believe in some of the things that were being taught in the church. But it wasn't until later on that I made a commitment to fully, follow Christ. After school, I went to grade 10 in Germany, which is one level at which you can graduate. And then I did an apprenticeship for 4.5 years as a dental technician. And after that, I decided to travel through Africa, backpack. And I had the address of some missionaries in Cameroon. And I ended up staying there with them for 6 months. And it was during those 6 months with these missionaries that I made a firm commitment to follow Christ.
Okay. Well, I guess, how did that happen? What went on in your heart and mind?
I started reading the Bible more and more, and just talking with these missionaries, the daily prayer times that they had. And one of the stories that really resonated with me was from the Old Testament, when I read the story of Naaman, a Syrian military commander who had leprosy. That's in 2 Kings chapter 5 in the Old Testament. And he was told that if he went into this river in Israel and dipped himself under the water 7 times, that he would be healed of his leprosy. And he got angry at that and thought that's way too simple. But his followers convinced him to do it, to try it, and he did get healed of his leprosy. And the way that story spoke to me was that there was sin. I was very aware of some of the things I had done in my life, that they were not right, that there was sin in my life. And I too thought at first that simply accepting Jesus' offer of forgiveness was too simple. And yet with these missionaries, I decided that I would do that, and I gave my life to Christ, asked for forgiveness for my past sins, and made a commitment to follow him. And then a while later, a verse from the New Testament really spoke to me, John chapter 12, verse 24, which says that unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single kernel, but if it falls in the ground and dies, it will be fruitful. And the way that spoke to me was that my career that I had chosen, dental technician, I had mainly gone into it. I did love the work, but I mainly went into it because it was a very lucrative career, could earn lots of money. And the way that verse spoke to me was that God had a different plan for my life, something in ministry, something working with people. And I chose then at that point to give up my career and to see what God would do if I gave my life to him in ministry.
Wow. So what did he do with your life in ministry? How did you become a pastor?
I was still with these missionaries in Cameroon, and started praying about what might the next step, where would I get some training for some kind of ministry. I didn't know at that point where I would go next.
Yeah.
And one day, the vehicle I was driving, this little Lada Niva, belonged to the missionaries, and I was driving it, and I was in this little village, a neighboring village called Labamba, and I had vehicle troubles. I can't remember exactly what was wrong with the vehicle, but the vehicle stood in front of this hut, and these 2 missionaries came out of this hut, and their names are Keith and Ruth Snyder. They live in Byzantin, Alberta, or were from Byzantin, Alberta. And I told them that I had made a commitment to Christ and that I felt called into ministry. And they gave me the address of the Peace River Bible Institute in Sexsmith.
Wow.
And Keith said that his dad was on the board there, and that would be a good place to go for some training if I felt called into serving in Christian ministry. So I saw that as God's answer to my prayers, that would be the next step. So
wow.
So I went back to Germany, settled all my affairs there, and came to Canada to go to Bible school.
Okay, wow. You were telling me that was also kind of the time of like the crisis of your dad's mental health struggles as well too.
Yes.
Do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the day after, 1 or 2 days after I left Germany to come to Bible school, my dad actually committed suicide.
Wow.
And it was interesting how I found out about it, because I only flew to New York. That was the cheapest flight I could find. And then I busted and hitchhiked across the US and Canada. And I ended up in Edmonton, waiting for a bus to get up to Grand Prairie to come to Bible school. And in Edmonton, I was walking the streets because I had a few hours, and I met 2 young men from my little hometown in Germany.
Wow.
By accident, so to speak. I think it was divine intervention. And they told me, they said, "Did you hear what happened last week?" It was already a week after my father's suicide. And I said, "No, back then, no cell phones, no social media, whatever."
Yeah.
And I said, "No, I have no idea what happened." And they told me that he had committed suicide. Wow. So I booked a flight the next day back to Germany, and I made it just in time for the funeral.
Wow.
So I was able to go to the funeral, and then I came back to Canada a couple days later. Anyway, so I was a week late for the beginning of Bible school, but I was able to be home for the funeral.
How do you process that? Like, what do you go through?
At the time, I didn't process it well at first, because my feeling was that it was my leaving that caused my father to commit suicide. So there was a lot of guilt in me, and I kind of shoved that down for a couple of years at least. I didn't really grieve his death and didn't process it well until beginning of my 3rd year at PRBI. I was in student leadership at that point, and during our leadership retreat at the beginning of the school, we watched a movie, a film that dealt with suicide and the effects of suicide, especially on family members. Yeah. And it was at that point that I started to grieve my father's death. I remember I cried for like 2 weeks after that, and just was able to process some of the emotions. And over time, I dealt with the guilt at that point, but I still felt that I was kind of at fault maybe. But over time, I have changed my perspective on that. I now think that my dad actually waited until I was gone before he took his own life, because he didn't want to hurt me, rather than that he took his own life because I had made a commitment to Christ and was throwing away a lucrative dental career in order to pursue this harebrained idea of Christian ministry. That was my.
That's what you originally
That's what
thought.
I had thought originally,
yeah.
But now, and I have a different perspective on my dad now than I did before when I was growing up. As a young child, I was always afraid of him, and as a teenager, then I kind of despised him.
Yeah.
But now I just feel sorry for him and have a lot more compassion as I look back on him and see some of the good things. I have an aunt, a half sister of my brother in Ontario, who's helped me have a different perspective. She was about 15 years or so younger than my dad, and saw him as a real big brother who loved her and took care of her. And I've been able to see more of the positive things about my dad as I look back now. So that's helped me to process some of those things as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
When did you get married?
1987. So my beginning of my 4th year at PRBI, Tracy and I got married. She started attending PRBI the first year that the same year I started PRBI, so we got to know each other. Actually, during our 2nd year, she was talking to one of her roommates about the guys at PRBI, and she said that Brian Burkhart, that's the one I would never date. So my first year was not easy at PRBI. I was just a new believer, and I had not learned to submit to the rules. I got kicked out for a couple of weeks during my first year. They would have kicked me out completely if I wouldn't have been from Germany, and they just said you can come back in 2 weeks. And anyway, so I had to learn to submit to some of the rules there. I couldn't believe it that you couldn't wear jeans during the day and you couldn't have a beer with your supper. And anyway, so had to learn some humility that first year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What was your marriage like?
Well, we've always been very committed to one another,
Yeah.
but the early years of our marriage were difficult. I was so involved after Bible school in ministry here at McLaurin Baptist Church, and Tracy with having 5 children fairly soon. Within the first 10 years of our marriage, we had 5 kids,
Yeah.
and we were basically living almost separate lives, very committed to each other, but I was so involved in ministry, often gone from early morning till late in the evening, didn't come home for supper because we were living out of town already,
Yeah.
out in the Webster area. And so she was involved with the kids and that whole thing, and I was involved with ministry. And so we were kind of living very separate lives, and there was a lot of maybe not tension so much, but unmet expectations, frustrations on both our parts as we were living these separate lives. So it wasn't easy then, but it's become much better and really healthy, our relationship in the years since.
Can you tell me a little bit about that process? Like what caused you to maybe get healthier or grow together?
In my case, it was through a burnout.
Yeah.
After 8 years of full-time ministry here at McLaurin, we helped to start the Webster Community Church. And so for 1 year, there was an overlap where I was the lead pastor here at McLaurin, and at the same time helping to establish and lead a new church out at Webster. And that was just way too much. And so after I finished at McLaurin in the spring of '96 and was full-time only at Webster, I just collapsed at that point and was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, I think it was. Severe headaches and just totally drained physically and emotionally.
Wow.
And I think I was off work completely for about 6 months, and it took about 2 years to fully recover from that. But it was the best thing that ever happened for me personally and for our family, for our marriage. It just was a turning point in my life to put things in the right perspective. God first, family second, and then ministry third.
Okay.
And there was some wrong understanding even of one of the books I read during that time was by Philip Yancey, The Jesus I Never Knew. And in one of the chapters, he talks about what the Father says to the Son, what God says to Jesus at his baptism, "You're my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased." And that really spoke to me that God was pleased with me because I was his son, not because I was doing all kinds of ministry work for him. And I realized that subconsciously, at least, there was some effort on my part to try and please God with doing all kinds of ministry, and that wasn't really necessary to please God. I didn't have to earn his favor.
Yeah.
So that was a turning point for me in many ways, to be more relaxed in ministry, to feel less guilty for taking time off, and to actually put family first ahead of ministry. And I think that's benefited the ministry in the years since as well, not just the family. So yeah.
Nice. I guess, how would you communicate that to somebody who maybe, because I've heard that message before, that God loves you. It's not about your works.
Yeah.
But deep down inside, to really understand that, how do you communicate that to somebody?
I think for different people, it might be different how that really sinks into your heart. For me, it had to be through this burnout, I think, that I really need to be knocked out and have this time where I'm not involved in ministry to be able to understand that. I think other people can simply tell themselves that truth. And if you tell yourself the truth and you speak the truth often enough, it does get into your heart and you don't have to go through a burnout. So I'm not sure how it works for everybody, but for me, it had to be a more critical time to learn that.
What does a healthy relationship with your wife look like today?
It's oftentimes it's communication, that we take the time to communicate with each other, to really talk about things that are not just superficial things.
Yeah.
In those first 10 years of our marriage, I think we talked a lot about who needs the vehicle next, what do we need to shop for groceries, how do we pay this bill, where do we go for a holiday, whatever. Those were kind of the things we talked about. And we did get some good advice from another couple that was kind of mentoring us. They said, go on a date once a week and don't talk about kids or work or finances.
Yeah.
Talk about anything else, but if we did that at that point, we didn't have a whole lot to talk about because those were the only things we talked about.
Yeah.
So that has really changed in our relationship. We plan 4 weekends a year where it's just Tracy and myself, usually in our cabin, and we talk about everything and pray with each other and really communicate. And we try and have lunch together whenever I am at home and just take the time to talk and communicate. So that's been really, really helpful.
Okay. Can you tell me, so you've been 30 plus years in the ministry now.
Yeah.
What are some of the highlights or some of the joys that you see?
Working with people and seeing change in people's lives, especially helping people overcome issues that maybe have been roadblocks in their life or that have been stumbling blocks or just difficulties. When you see positive change in people's lives, boy, that's just wonderful. That makes it all worth it.
Nice.
Sometimes that's a long-term process, sometimes that small steps, but as long as I see that there are steps going in the right direction, that's really, really encouraging. And just looking back, seeing the hand of God at work. When we moved out to Webster, we had no idea that a Webster church would ever start. And looking back now to see how God orchestrated those things so that church could be established, I think that's just such a highlight in looking back over the ministry that we've had. The same thing with going to Germany a few years ago when my mom was really ill with cancer, and then just seeing how God put us in that retreat center in Germany at just the right time to help them work through some issues that they were facing. So lots of things where I can look back and say, wow, God really has his hand in these things. You often don't see it at the time, but when you look back, you see how he coordinates things and lines things up, and that's a wonderful thing. Yeah.
That's awesome. What kind of advice would you give to fathers and mothers in raising children?
Be concerned about your children's hearts, not just about their behavior, about the outward appearances. Don't worry so much about the length of their hair or whether they have a piercing or something. Yeah. Be concerned about where their hearts are at, that their hearts are tender towards the Lord and towards others. And Shepherding a Child's Heart is one of the books that we've read and used in our raising children. Keep the communication open with your kids. Don't put barriers there. So just as one example, if they come home and tell you something that they did and it was really not a good thing, don't get angry at them and yell at them. That puts up barriers. They won't want to tell you that same thing next time. So make sure the doors of communication stay open so that your kids are always willing to talk to you. And another thing I would say is as they grow older, give them more and more freedom. Some parents, they try and keep their kids on the straight and narrow until they leave home, and then all of a sudden the kids have to learn how to handle all this freedom. Mm-hmm. Start giving them freedom as they're younger already, and start helping them to explore choices of their own, and then help them to evaluate those choices and see what was good and what was not so good, so that once they leave home, they actually know how to handle the freedom of leaving home. So that'd be another thing I would encourage parents with. Okay. Yeah.
What would you maybe say to a pastor who might be struggling, like the way that you were struggling earlier through ministry burnout? Like what kind of advice would you give that man?
I would definitely say to not put ministry ahead of family. Yeah. Put family ahead of ministry. I think that not only that's not only biblical, but it benefits your family and your ministry if you have your priorities right. Mm-hmm. I would also say seek professional help, seek counsel, wise counsel, if you feel that you are under stress in the ministry. Obviously, there's something is askew, something is not right if there's this stress there, and you feel that it's all a burden. It shouldn't be all a burden when you're in ministry. Something is out of balance. Yeah.
Okay. What are your thoughts on young people these days, or what kind of advice would you give to them?
To young people, I would say, first of all, similar to the parents, keep the communication open. Keep communication open with your parents and with your siblings. That's your family. You'll have them all your life, and it's good to keep that communication open. I would also say seek a good peer group if you don't have one already. Friends that really can help you make good decisions, good choices. Friends that can correct you if it's necessary. Friends that can help you in your faith. And also maybe seek a mentor. If it's not your parents, one of your parents that can really mentor you, seek somebody else that's a little more mature, a little older maybe, a little further along in their faith, and meet with them regularly, help, be honest and open with them so you have somebody that can give input to your life and help you along the way.
Okay. What are your thoughts on the Christian church? Maybe the state of the church today?
Oh, I'm torn.
Yeah.
Mixed feelings. On the one hand, I'm discouraged and disappointed at some of the things that are coming out about abuse and other things that are happening at the highest levels in church and Christian leadership. On the other hand, I see young people who are on fire for the Lord and who are genuine in their faith, and who have a very openness towards other believers from other denominations and backgrounds. And so I have a lot of hope for the future, as well as concerns about the present state of the church too. So yeah, kind of a mixed bag.
Why do you think God allows such hypocrisy and abuse and all the perversion that we're seeing? Like, why does he allow that in the church? Why doesn't he cleanse it himself? Any insight into that one?
I find that a difficult. I don't have an answer that completely satisfies me, let alone an answer I can give to other people. I mean, I look at the same thing in the Old Testament. Why did God allow the people of Israel to make so many foolish decisions?
Yeah.
Why didn't he destroy them for that? Or cause them to stay more faithful to him? I guess God gives us, one answer is that God gives us the freedom to choose. It doesn't matter whether that's the freedom which socks I wear in the morning or the freedom to abuse a child. I mean, the freedom that he gives us is genuine freedom. And so we don't all follow the Holy Spirit as we go through the day. Sometimes there are temptations that we fall to, and God allows it. Yeah. And I think it does a lot of damage to our witness, a lot of damage to the body of Christ. But by his grace, he is still at work, and is still drawing people unto himself. And I continue to hang on to faith in spite of those things. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Awesome.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Brian.